topic is Achieving Humanity, the Affinity and the Relevance of the Ideas of Iqbal and Henri Bergson. And to speak on this topic, we have Souleymane Bachir Diagne. At one level, he doesn't need any lengthy introduction. He has a very distinguished academic career. Originally hailing from Senegal, he went to France for his bachelor's studies and then postgraduate studies, getting a PhD in philosophy. And just his personal background, personal biography, just the person he is. It's a number of different worlds intersecting in his person and in his scholarship, reflected in his scholarship. A West African Muslim studying in France, not losing touch with his roots in Senegal, not losing touch with his roots in the Muslim tradition, opening himself up to a new world of ideas in France, Western thought, Western philosophy, and this is reflected in his, as I said before, his scholarship. I just want to say this much before we get to the talk per se. I have been familiar with Professor Diagne for quite a while. He does not know me, but I do know him much better, quite well. He wrote a book, Islam and Open Society, 10, 15 years ago. I benefited tremendously from that book. The foreword to that book was written by Charles Taylor, a little two-page description on the relevance of Muhammad Iqbal, or the importance of Muhammad Iqbal in the 21st century. And then Professor Diagne himself contributed a chapter to a book that I co-edited on with Chad Hillier on the contemporary relevance of the reconstruction of Islamic thought in Islam. And the chapter that Professor Diagne contributed, we forwarded the copies of that chapter to many of the participants, and it is exactly on this topic, Bergson and Iqbal. Professor Diagne, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us, and on a personal level, it's an honor to sit in front of someone considered to be an elder. And someone on whose work I've learned and benefited tremendously. So thank you. When I was first contacted about the possibility of this program, and my colleague, Dr. Farouk Khan, said that the person we are inviting him is Souleymane Bachir Diagne, I said yes right away. As soon as I heard the name, I said yes, I am in, and I will do whatever I can to contribute to this session. So, Professor Diagne, welcome, and thank you for joining us. So, should we get into our discussion right away? That Bergson and Iqbal. Before we get into Bergson and Iqbal specifically, would you please say a few words about the intellectual environment at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in which both of these thinkers are doing their work. I think it's important to get a historical context, or historical sense of what the world was like at the time when they both were engaged in their scholarship. So we begin our discussion there.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning, because I'm in the morning, New York. Before I end, to say a few words of gratitude, Institut Français, obviously, for having me for this day, and to you, to the university, and to yourself. It is really an honor and a pleasure to meet you, although it is just virtual. I am looking forward to having the possibility of being Pakistan, since I would definitely like to go to Lahore. Unfortunately, this has never happened. This is as far as close coming to that I have been able to until now, and I'm ready for that. I'm also very happy part of the Nuit des Mr. Gerard, I have participated in quite a session this day, and actually participated in the first one when it created Paris by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs then. And it is a pleasure for participating again in Nuit des Idées, and to do that in a way in Pakistan virtually. and about philosophers, Bergson, who are real top of philosophers, as you have mentioned, dear Dr. Wasi. So, without further ado, start with answering that question by Bergson first. Bergson is considered to be, let me quote here, a thinker, a third to whom I have devoted some. That thinker is Leopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, but that was played. He was primarily a poet and a philosopher, and very much like me. And Leopold Sédar Senghor has famously said that the 20th century really started in 1889. And what he had in mind saying was that radically happened in 89 when Henri Bergson, French philosopher, published his first book, which was his dissertation that he turned the next year. And the title of that book was Essai immédiat de la conscience, an essay of data of consciousness. There is an English translation, a classic English translation of that book, which is not the literal title from the French, which is rather time. That is how this book by Bergson translated into English. And the reason why Senghor said that this was the 20th century is that something radically new and revolutionary happened in the history of Western philosophy. That book, mainly a new thinking by Bergson about very important one, the concept of intuition as reality. Along with the more analytical of reality, Bergson, we have more immediate knowledge of reality that intuition. Second aspect is thinking, the notion of élan vital. Élan vital, to present it, the notion that there is a push of life in the universe is not something already completed, but it is a continuous open-ended. So we have an open cosmology. The world is not created or done once all. It is always in evolution. So this application of evolution coming from sciences, Darwinian sciences, Lamarckian science, to philosophy was an important of Bergson's thought. One third aspect of that, of the revolution represented, was the duration, time, as Bergson considered that Western philosophy in general had missed for too long the very nature of time, because instead of time, it has been thinking a spatialized translated to space. And in fact, when the thinks about, they spatialize, consider that time is simply the distance separating one moment from another given moment. And I'm using on purpose the word distance here, which is a spatial notion. So in order to time, since the philosophy Western thought had think time in terms of space. And it is about time, says, that we come back as, that is to say, time not as something spatialized is to do, but extending the very fold of real duration as time. Coming back, in a way, doing that, the pre-Socratic time that you find in Heraclitus, etc. But let's not be too technical. Simply say these three notions what became very widespread. Now we remember that Bergson was very, very famous in his time. We do not realize how famous he was, but he was almost a rock star in his time, which means that Bergson translated very early. It's not something that happened, but he translated very early. And thinking was very present in the UK at the time. Iqbal himself traveled to what is become his dissertation on the development of metaphysics in Islam. So Iqbal came in contact with Bergson thought very early when he came and he was struck by the main concepts that Bergson that were identified with thought. To quickly come back to those, had in the spiritual truth of Islam that himself very well, of course. So this counter between Iqbal starting this dissertation, and Bergson, what I would understand under your question concerning environment. So to summarize, I would say that Iqbal came to Europe, UK, at a time when the philosophical atmosphere was defined, among others. You had, or we should not be forgetting that you had at that time development of analytical philosophy, Russell, Whitehead, things happening in the field of philosophy. But in a way, the philosophical movement, not only in France but in Europe, was defined by the Bergsonian evolution. And in the elements, in the different aspects of the Bergsonian elements, Iqbal saw something that was responding to concepts that knew very well in his own Islamic, the concept emerging cosmology that I meant when Bergson about Elan Vital was not foreign. The concept of intuitive knowledge, the knowledge is analytical knowledge that through separation the object and the subject, but some form of coincidence, the subject and the object was not foreign to him either. And the notion of time as duration also was not foreign to him, but found an echo in a hadith that Iqbal likes to quote again in his work, which is the hadith that says, "Do not vilify time because time is God." That identification of time, God, for him was to be read in conversation with what Bern had to say about time as duration. So hopefully I have described very quickly the atmosphere, environment, that encounter, which was both a real encounter, two of them in person, but which was more important intellectual and even in a way spiritual encounter the two philosophers had.
It's really helpful. Please correct me if I'm wrong. When we see what Bergson ignited, is the 3 points that you mentioned, and the 3 points which Allama Iqbal is finding very, very attractive when we encounter Bergson's thought later on. On one level, Bergson's understanding of intuition as a source of knowledge, in making that claim, it looks like that he is both building on and challenging the Cartesian Kantian conception of reason and the Cartesian Kantian dismissal of intuition, sentiment, classically called the spirit. So here, Bergson building on and beyond important essential claim of Enlightenment philosophy, and in his conception of Elan Vital, at one level, he is very clearly going beyond Newtonian understanding in scientific terms of a fixed, static, finished universe. So it looks like Bergson's work is challenging a central tenet of both Cartesian Kantian Enlightenment philosophy and Newtonian science. And as you mentioned, he's not the only one who's doing it. In 1905 is Einstein. 10 is Whitehead and Russell. There are others who also. So when we talk about the context, there's a context in which Enlightenment philosophy and Newtonian science are being challenged. Parts of them are being affirmed, but other parts are being challenged. And Bergson's in the vanguard of this movement, and it is this part of Bergson that is quite attractive to Allama Iqbal. Is that correct? Is that a correct reading?
Absolutely. Yes, and that is why the atmosphere and the environment encounter took place, because both of them, Iqbal mentioned, did challenge Kant's. You cannot intuition really. Kant famously dismissed any aspect he called intellectual, and saying that this is not possible. We cannot. The noumenon itself stay at the level of the phenomenon, everything that in time and space. And again, here we can see how this is connected to very spatialized of time. When Kant says that time, the form in which phenomena appear, so time becomes a kind of frame. Thinking of time as is a way of immobilizing you. A frame is something spatial. When we talk about a spatial frame, and we do not have the surge, the continuous newness of time identified in his life. And yes, what you say about Elan Vital against a Newtonian conception of the word, an immobile conception of the word, again, to that oppose precisely of continuous emerging cosmology, and while found that the Quran itself, for him, in a way, Muslims have lost the sense of Quranic when they translated their cosmology in the Aristotelian Greek notion of cosmology. You had this stable system of the center and everything else turned around the earth. And he considered that coming back to what one could call, paradoxical as it sounds, a Bergsonian thing of the Quran, he calling the attempt of Muslims to verses always affirm that creation is still on, that God has created the world once and for all as some kind of immobile frame, but creative action is at work, word continues. Adding to that, the particular role of a being, and this is also a very important aspect of Iqbal's and his in conversation with Bergson, the idea the human here has to play a particular role, creative as a co-worker with God in achieving that open-ended cosmology. The fact that the is still being, is still becoming, going towards its achievement, and that as co-workers, God, co-work in translation, the notion of khilafah, the Quranic of khilafah, God having his khalif, meaning for Iqbal, that this is the responsibility, the trust responsibility to participate in the work to participate in achieving creation. And this found a very strong echo with Elan Vital, and also is another note important that I would like to emphasize here. The notion that the movement towards achieving our humanity, the movement of life in general, is towards the goal of life to go from dispersion, material dispersion, towards individualized organism, coming and seeking to become an individual. So this march towards individuality, this march towards being an ego or a person, this march towards the word that Iqbal used from is the general march of this elan. Elan goes towards egohood or personhood, and being an ego is achieved only in God, and because life, even if life strives towards individuation, it can never achieve it because the very principle of life precisely. And if you are reproducing yourself, by definition, you are losing your individuality in your own production. If I reproduce myself, then I am not. So the enemy of individuation, as Iqbal puts it, is actually within the individual itself. And by saying that, he is quoting Bergson. Now, to show philosophical idea about what it means to be an individual, the fact that life, along with reality, how this is translated by his own overriding goal of the religious thought of Islam, we can see how this notion of individuality, he turned it a way of understanding the notion that God is the only individual, and that he is striving towards becoming. The goal is to achieve individuality, to become as much as perfect etymology of perfection being done without seeing that. And Iqbal uses that reconstruction of the religious thought of Islam as the meaning of Surah Al-Ikhlas from the Quran. This idea that he interprets, he has a tafsir of Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is precisely enlightened in a way by this notion that he shares with Bergson, that life of is towards individuation, and that only is and everything trying going to individuation. That's what does as well. Yeah.
Thank you. We definitely want to come back. We want to come back to how these points of convergence, these two great thinkers, how relevant are they, and which particular problems are they relevant to us in the 21st century. But before we get there, before we touch on that point, if you could just take a little bit of time, this encounter between Bergson and Iqbal, intellectual encounter was not intellectual encounter, it was a personal encounter. They wrote to one another, they actually also met one another in 1930 and 1931. Because, what's been happening over the past 25 years. Many academic careers have been made on this clash of civilization thesis. Many academics have been made, many political careers have been made, many military have been made, pushing this forward. But when we look at the Iqbal and Bergson, we don't see a clash of civilizations. Was this like a one-off thing in the late 19th century, early 20th century? Is it only Iqbal and Bergson that are interacting with each other at this very, very high level, at a very, very high intellectual level? Or are there other examples, a little bit before them, a little bit after them, of other Muslim thinkers, Western Indian thinkers, Chinese thinkers, and Western thinkers who are in this type of converse with each other? Where we don't see a clash of civilization, we see two deeply informed, complete individuals, both these two different civilizations in deep engagement with each other.
Absolutely. And this is a very important aspect. You are absolutely right. I think that encounter with these two thinkers, two giants of contemporary thought, Iqbal and are not yet an example of encounters between thinkers beyond any clash of civilization. And an example that comes to mind is, for example, encounter Ernest Renan and Jamaluddin Afghani when they had this encounter in Paris, and Renan really greeted Jamaluddin Afghani as a thinker with whom he could share his thoughts, disagree, and have a conversation in very friendly and terms, just some truth. And that it changed. Renan and Afghani say something about what it means meeting in thought when thinkers from the East, and let's use those terms, the East and the West, meet beyond any and this is important because it reproduces something that has already happened in the history itself. History of philosophy would have been possible without the encounter thought by thinkers beyond any of the clash of when, for example, the Muslim word gave quality, translate, and worked from Greek philosophy. It was the same idea of being others and taking advantage of what had thought it by be it from civilization, etc. You had at first to sort of overcome the resistance. You always have resistance in these encounters of people who are more on the side of the clash of civilizations are different. So you did have people in the word where the Muslim word through its expansion incorporated in a way, places where philosophy was studied, who would say, oh, we cannot be in what these Greek people thought, what they love of wisdom, because we have the true religion, we have our civilization, an idea of a clash. And it was fortunate that the other 10 people who said, well, we do have revelation, but still can benefit from what somebody is thinking, and that this is precisely what our itself asks for, this openness to others. It is fortunate this is the trend that eventually won that confrontation. And again, this was repeated in medieval time. If you take someone like Thomas, who was canonized after the church under the name Saint Thomas, people forget before he became Saint Thomas, he had been first condemned by the Archbishop of Paris as heretical thesis, and those he was accused of holding were considered Averroes thesis. In other words, he was criticized. Thomas criticized for benefited from the thought of his Latinized form of his name as Averroes. That means that the encounter between Thomas and Ibn Rushd had happened beyond the different religions and civilizations which they built. And this is the life of thought. This encounter between thinkers beyond particular civilization they are coming from. So this trying to see where the converses are, this is a lesson for us. It is a lesson also for our time. The encounter in Thomas Aquinas and Rushd, the encounter in Al-Afra and Ernest, the encounter Muhammad Iqbal and Bergson are less for us. These times where we are very troubled because the word seems coming back to tribal. We are tribes. Everybody in their own tribe, and is justified by the tribe, the other tribe is nothing to learn from them, etc. There is that trend at work in our world today, and this is why these encounters are full of lessons. Who would imagine that by a husband who was Jewish, attracted towards, although he never really converted, could say that an echo of a thinker like Iqbal in the Causes Honoring, but that is what humanity means. That is thought. That is philosophy means. These possible encounters beyond just the tribal that has been considered as a clash. The idea that when civilizations come to contact, they necessarily are in a clash.
Diagne, it's not just this clash of civilization thesis on which many academic careers have been built. It's also the case that I find it shocking 19, 20-year-old students sitting in my class walking around using the phrase dead white men and by extension dead brown men. That these people are nothing of value to teach us, nothing of value that we can learn from them. In a very, very offhanded way, dismissing the scholarship of individuals because of their race. First of all, they're dead, because they're dead means their history, and history has nothing of value to just. They're white, they're white by definition. There must be racist and imperialist, especially if they're late 19th, early 20th century, and they're men. Obviously, there must be misogyny and women and patriarchy in their work. That this attitude that we find become so prevalent, and it's not just that we have to learn from the encounters between Bergson and Iqbal and Aquinas and Ibn Rushd and so on and so forth. At one level, am I misreading? We have something to learn from your work also. A senior scholar from university who thinks that these dead white, yellow men, women, whatever the case may be, they still speak to us in the 21st century, and they speak to us in ways that if we cannot move beyond our immediate historical intellectual context, they speak to us in ways we simply cannot even imagine.
Absolutely. I'm surprised by that phrase here. When we talk about this phrase again ad nauseam, these are just dead white. Obviously, the idea behind that, the idea that true learning and the very most knowledge should never be petrified, and this is very Iqbalian idea of avoiding any kind of metaphor. Iqbal, by the way, the problem is Muslim thought, and the reason why it needs reconstruction is that it has petrified at point. So petrified the enemy. So of petrified is the contrary of the very root of knowledge. It should be a living movement. There should be also elan vital. It means that the canon is not something petrified, but something that we revisit and rework all the time. Yes, but the problem is do not have that sense. We talk of these so-called dead white men. On the contrary, this is a translation of what I've been calling early tribal, and you transfer it into the sphere of knowledge. Tribal is bad in politics. We see it. It is lethal when it comes to epistemological consideration. Tribal is in the pursuit of knowledge is the enemy of knowledge, and this is a danger. A danger now because these phrases that are that are used without they prevent. Oh, these are I sing them. I have to learn, especially he had said things that I consider racist and so on. And you go from toppling statues, for example, in South Africa, the movement about Rhodes fall, and you transfer Rhodes, obviously Cecil Rhodes represented, then to fall intellect, and you say, okay, let's dismiss Kant, let's dismiss Plato, let's dismiss so and so because they are men. This is very dangerous, and it is ignorance masquerading as, and that is the problem. You develop tribal and anti, and think that you are justified politically in so because you consider this is decolonizing the thought. Of course, who would not want to colonize science? But decolonizing is very dangerous. You do not really ask yourself what does mean and what does teach us. And this is why these lessons encounters are knowledge encounters. Knowledge happens at the borders, at the frontier, where meet. And we can see it even in the progress of the innovative thinking happens most of the time at the frontier when they meet, not when enclosed in their own. Same is the very mode of knowledge. So yes, the idea of never being a petrified is something that obviously Iqbal's thing as well. Petrification is the enemy, but this should not be any form tribal thinking, and this new author is absolutely dangerous in this case.
Just really quickly, because I would like to open up the floor for questions and answers. We haven't even gotten into the real part of our discussion. This was all supposed to be the prelude to we wanted to take those 3 points of convergence between Iqbal and Bergson and discuss their direct relevance to some of the global problems we're facing today. But it's obvious when to get there. First of all, I would like to beg your indulgence and give us another 15 minutes. We were supposed to finish at 6:30 because we started a little bit late. You give us 15 minutes more for questions and answers. Is that okay with you, Professor?
No problem.
Thank you. I just want to. I've done a little bit of work in sociology. Just listening to the way you were discussing how tribalism is dangerous in politics, it's definitely at the level of epistemology and at the level of thought, and just that to dismiss that an entire corpus of a thinker because of one text that he has written, or not even one text, one chapter in that text, or not just one chapter in a text, one paragraph in a chapter in a text that he has written, to dismiss the entire corpus as irrelevant. As a sociologist of religion, this reminds me of the Khawarij, or of the Khawarij mentality, where a minor sin by a Muslim makes that Muslim by definition a kafir, and not just a kafir, makes it permissible to take a life of that Muslim, kill that Muslim, for just one minor sin that person may have done, even if it wasn't forgetfulness. So this is that Khawariji mentality when you take one mistake or even a set of mistakes that a thinker has done, and we dismiss their entire purpose. We know that in the history of religion how damaging this was, the history of early Islam, this movement, and how damaging it is even today. In religious circles, we have the exact same mentality. So this thing of dismissing dead white men because of their deadness and their whiteness and maleness is no different than dismissing the work of, not just the work, the word of an individual, the woman, just because they're African, just because there's something else. That how odious that is to dismiss the claims of anyone based on these markers. How odious it is, and how in the university setting, how deadly this is. So it is. We can see in both the life and the works of these great thinkers that one of the things that made them great is that they did not let these markers be hindrance in terms of their engagement with others. I hope that we get to the second part of this conversation sometime later, because I do want to talk about the contemporary environmental crisis and how these 3 points help us to think through that crisis more intelligently, and how these points of convergence between Bergson and Iqbal help to think through the divisions within societies and the divisions among societies, how they help us through these things more intelligently. We won't be able to get to that today. Hopefully, can you give me a commitment that inshallah, when time permits, that we will continue this conversation in the future? I'm going to get that commitment first before I begin the question.
Inshallah.
So I open it up. Both to the online, to the in-person, the people who are present here, to your questions. How we are philosophy was not well received either by the traditional ulama or by the secular educated elite here. That there was strong resistance to him from both parties. Nomad is asking, how was Bergson's philosophy received in France when he articulated it?
Okay. Thank you. That's a very important question. Yes, indeed. Any kind of, I would say, revolutionary thinking, when you invite people to look at things in a way, you always create that kind of resistance that can be hostility as well. In the end, something that happened to both thinkers, by the way, is that after in the newness of what they were bringing, they have been afterwards claimed by everybody. I mean, Iqbal is claimed from the right, the left, in a way. Everybody has their own Iqbal to side and force, and very different people. Same thing with Bergson. Bergson was as well by people from extreme right in France, Charles Maurras, who collaborated with Nazism, Nazi Germany, etc., or Barres by thought. But on the other hand, social in France. So at first, resist ideas advanced. For philosophically, for example, all the neo-Kantian was right that he challenged Kant. You had all these neo-Kantian thinkers who considered that Bergson was just an irrational, that the notion of that you cannot explain, immediate knowledge of things that even beyond language was just irrational. The fact that he was himself attracted with the spiritual aspects of experience was just irrational. You have to remember that we are at very strongly time or in France. In a way, Bergson sort of aimed at putting an end to positive science represented to Kant and this belief in the power of rational, and that reason and science is the new religion, and that really is going to appear. On the contrary, his last book, the last book alive, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, Bergson insisted the role, the particular played by in the society, believing, for example, our own idea of humanity one, beyond our tribes, an idea that comes from the philosophical reading, of course, but mainly religion. And he says, he wrote that religion is much more efficient in teaching humanity the very notion of shared humanity than reason or philosophical reason itself, because this image that religion just spreads like a fire, capable of spreading like a fire. So you had all the rationalist, positive, anti-thinking side who were hostile to Bergson. This is the kind of hostility he met, and you are absolutely right, put in parallel with the fact that me as Iqbal think was misunderstood at first by ulama. The kind of that was met also by Afghan, the conservatism ulama think that you can be Muslim in the same way that an Iraqi person is century, which doesn't make sense. So this idea, for example, emerging a particular role as Khalifatullah fil Ard, the Caliph of God upon earth, and etc., were challenging in a way for conservative tradition, or the idea of precisely this exaltation of personal individuality could see traditional ulama who think about what he was saying as a form worship the self, the nafs, because they were taught that the nafs is the enemy, and that precisely becoming who you have to become in jihad against the nafs, jihad as the hadith goes, jihad and so forth. So what was the exalted way of so yeah, you can all the possible that appears here, and a refusal of ijtihad. Muslims consider that ijtihad is very important, but at the same time they say it, they never engaged truly to ijtihad. They are always, traditional ulama are actually the decision taken in the present, connected to the past. You are always looking for present. Even the mujtahid, so obstacle ijtihad that ijtihad is great. The mujtahid praise, but then mujtahid, you have to know 500 cases, changing a role, etc. You have to know X amount of practice. You do not realize that actually again just the present case of have decide under the command of the connected to the past instead of connect to the possible future. You are not that the future is what dictating the actions you take today. you are thinking that the is what has to dictate the action conduct. And that is a way of never getting out of unification. So yes, it was inevitable in a way that these conservative people, both in the case of Bergson and in the case of Iqbal, would oppose their project. And
thank you. Any other questions? Diagne, Askari has asked about the individual and individuation.
Okay.
That this is a buzzword. It's a buzzword on campus. It's a buzzword in popular culture. Achieving your individuality, attaining your individuality, becoming individual. The questioner has asked that is Bergson's notion of individual and Iqbal's notion of individuation, is it the same as an autonomous individual who achieves his or her individuality cut off from and independent of relations to others?
Thank you so much. This is a very important question. There is a distinction to make here. Individuation has nothing to do with the individualism that we are so much praising as a buzzword. And you're right, here that I am myself. That we see, by the way, is understanding of freedom by people that going against vaccines and affirmation of their freedom, etc. But I don't want to enter that controversy, although I would be surprised on campus of those. But no, in this case, the philosophical notion coming an organ, and Iqbal compares that with Individuation. What he has in mind, the trust that the human being as such, as the say that trust, this amana in proposed beings, mountains, strengths, etc. Only the human has accepted trust of becoming a trust of personality. That stage of being a human is not a state precisely, is a task. To be a human is to have responsibility and the task of becoming. Achieving personality and personality as individuality. Individuality is not just, looking at what belongs to me, what as an and that, and I affirm my individuality. On the contrary, individuality is here. Individuation goes with the responsibility of fulfilling my duty as a being, that is to say, fulfilling my duty as the khilafah that God has given me, and that nobody else could receive. That everything else, if a mountain says exploding and scattered, but they have it. In the same way, the individuality in Bergson has to going against dispersion. In fact, he's always saying that we are not parts, isolates coming together in a technical way, but organ together. This is the opposition between what it to be organized as life, just put together as components. That is how they the notion of individuality. So achieve individuality has not with the posture of individualism in this sense. It is, on the contrary, a way of trying and can of God. God is the only God can, and that is what Surah Al-Ikhlas says, "Qul huwallahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad." I mean, samad itself means that absolute singularity, that absolute individuality. It is a very difficult word to translate than I do. And the reason for that is that it is an attack. The word samad appears only once. Any other name of God or qualification for God appears many times. So you can make comparison, because that is how we understand it, by seeing it employed in. And if you have a word that is employed just in that particular case, how would you understand it? Iqbal, in conversation with Bergson, understands like that the chapter Ikhlas precisely. This absolute affirmation of the individuality of God. When it says Lam yalid wa yulad, if nothing comes out of it, proceeds from nothing and nothing comes out of it. And that is defined. And now, if something proceeds from you, if you are able to reproduce, then you cannot be an individual. So this philosophical, metaphysical notion of individuality, understanding achieving individuality as your vis-a-vis achieving humanity in general, and the care of God, because this is a very important aspect, given the fact that we have environmental crisis and understanding the khilafah of God, custodian of God creation. This is what I do, what I cherish, so-called freedom.
Thank you. I mean, if I heard you, if I heard correctly, that the popular notion of individuality equates individuality with autonomy, absolute autonomy. Iqbal's notion of individuality equates individuality with consciously taking the trust or carrying the trust which has been trusted to the human being by God. There's no notion, there's no possibility of an individual becoming an individual if they do not consciously undertake to fulfill the trust which has been entrusted to them by God. And for Bergson, there's no way people can attain their individuality unless they become organically a part of something that is bigger than them, an organ or an organism that is bigger than them. Was that an accurate summary of what you had said?
Indeed, and I thank you for that.
There's another. We have some more questions. I don't. Okay. Dr. Diagne, we do have a bunch of other questions, both written and in person, but we do not want to take more of your time because we know that you have a class and commitments. It is a Tuesday morning. With your permission, whatever we do is with your permission next. With your permission, do we close the program or have one more question?
Okay, let's have one more. Yes.
Yes. Okay. No, very important question, a practical question, and it's not easy to navigate because we are individuals. We have to make this decision, right? For thinkers, students of thought from parts of the world that have a history of colonization, and I would correct a history of brutal colonization. When we look at Algeria, Vietnam. When we look at what the British did to the ulama in 1857 in this part of the world, we have a history of brutal colonization. What was done in West Africa, what was done in Congo. These are not facts that should be forgotten, and they cannot be forgotten. Now, for those of us who are coming from these parts of the world, and we're part of these communities, how does one achieve that balance between decolonizing philosophical thought and learning from the West? And this is an excellent point. We want to both decolonize ourselves because that legacy is still at work. At the same time, we would want to be open to the West. How does one achieve that balance? And on this point, if you could answer this question, I would really appreciate it. Maybe in some personal terms, how have you struck this balance? What has helped you as an individual to strike this balance?
This is a very important question, and I'm glad we did not end before this question because obviously it is an important, not really susceptible of just very straightforward answer because we have all of us to ponder, meditate it. Obviously, yes, striking the right balance, taking into account the brutality of oppression, colonial, and on the other hand, what we have, you and I, in conversation, described as together is something that we need to think about very, very carefully. I've written a book to which I've given the title Bergson Post-Colonial, and this provocative title because Bergson never said a word about his radar to talk about not one thing. Nevertheless, here is an author who has been so important in the colonial. And why is that? Why was he so important for post-colonial, not just Iqbal, but other side in West Africa, Senghor? And the reason why I'm this book of mine and provocative is that within the West, you have also post-think, and that is something to not be ignoring. In other words, as Edward Said said, do not wear physical lens when we are looking. If we have a mass of what and a massive notion of what the way we are trapped in a way. There is nothing as the West also. The West, what the West? Of course, we have to look at the elements. What at one point meant for the West to just expand outside of it and have this brutal forced labor in West Africa colonially. Yes, this has to be acknowledged and taken into account also every thought that within the West itself goes against that face of. And Bergson is a good example of that, precisely because he's someone who never say anything for or against colonialism. Colonialism not just on horizon, but he a thought that was for colonials or thinkers from colonial world who were themselves engaged in the work of fighting against colonialism of the West. So this is how I would a very first preliminary tentative response to that question. And I have the sense that it is preliminary and tentative because beyond this particular, you can have also more complicated notion of what this means. But basic bottom line in what I'm saying is that we solve metaphysical unquestioned identity that we call the way applicated. For example, when people say that we have to oppose our own epistemology as a historian, I know that is not such a thing as the epistemology of the West. This is simplification. When we say our epistemology of the West was at one point Aristotelian, and then it went against Aristotelian and Ptolemaic notion of cosmology, and so on and so forth. So you have many epistemologies. Science is a history's place, is always unfolding. So when we terms that are not petrified, but in terms of historicity and so on and so forth, when we think along the lines of Iqbal, who says, do not vify time because time is God, we understand fully that hadith that he quotes again and again, may find a way of creating conversion and openness movement towards what Bergson called open society, precisely achieving our humanity together in spite, not in ignorance of, but in spite of every that historical.
Numan asks that Iqbal's philosophy was not well received either by the traditional ulama or by the secular educated elite here. That there was strong resistance to him from both parties. Numan is asking, how was Bergson's philosophy received in France when he articulated it?
As we have done, unfortunately,
Okay.
for so.
Thank you. That's a very important question. Yes, indeed. Any kind of, I would think, revolutionary thinking, when you invite people to look at things in a different way, you always create that kind of resistance that can be hostility as well. In the end, something that happened to both thinkers, by the way, is that afterwards, after a moment of hesitation between the newness of what they were bringing, they have been afterwards claimed by everybody. I mean, Iqbal is claimed from the right to the left in a way. Everybody has their own Iqbal and their own verses to cite and so on and so forth, and very different people. Same thing with Bergson. Bergson was as well received by people from the extreme right in France, Charles Maurras, who collaborated further with Nazism, Nazi Germany, etc., or Barres, were very much influenced by Bergson thought. But on the other hand, also socialists in France. So at first you had this resistance to the ideas advanced. For philosophically, for example, all the neo-Kantians, and Dr. Wasid was right pointing that he challenged Kantism, but you had all these neo-Kantian thinkers who considered that Bergson was just an irrationalist, that the notion of intuition that you cannot explain, this immediate knowledge of things that is even beyond language, was just irrationalism, and the fact that he was himself attracted with spiritual aspects of the human experience was just irrationalism. You have to remember that we are at that time living in a very strongly positivistic time also in France. In a way, the Bergson's revolution aimed at putting an end to positivism, to positivistic science represented by Auguste Comte, and this belief in the power of rationalism, and that reason and science is the new religion, and that religion is going to disappear. On the contrary, in his last book, the last book he published while he was still alive, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, Bergson insisted on the role, the particular role played by religion in the open society, believing, for example, that our own idea of humanity being one beyond our tribes, is an idea that comes from religion, philosophical religion, of of course, but mainly religion. And he says, he wrote that religion is much more efficient in teaching humanity the very notion of a shared humanity than reason or philosophical reason itself, because he uses this image that religion just spreads like a fire, is capable of spreading like a fire. So you had all these thinkers on the rationalist, positivist, anti-religion, free-thinking side who were hostile to Bergson. So this is the kind of hostility he met. And you're absolutely right, putting this in parallel with the fact that many aspects of Iqbal's thinking also was misunderstood at first by the traditional ulama tradition. The kind of resistance that was met also by Afghani, the conservatism of traditional ulama who think that you can be a Muslim in the same way that an Iraqi person was in the 8th century, which doesn't make sense. So this idea, for example, of an emerging cosmology, of the particular role of the human being as Khalifatullah fil Ard, the Caliph of God upon earth, and etc. These were challenging in a way for conservatives' traditional thinking, or the idea of precisely this exaltation of personhood, of individuality. It could seem to traditional ulama who did not really think about what he was saying as a form of worshipping the self, the nafs, because they were taught that the nafs is the enemy, and that precisely becoming who you have to become is being in jihad against the nafs. Jihad nafs, as the the hadith goes, is the greatest jihad, and so on and so forth. So what was this exaltation of the khudi? Is it a way of so yeah, you can see all the misunderstanding, the possible misunderstanding that appears here, and a refusal of ijtihad. Muslims consider that ijtihad is very important, but at the same time they say it, they never engaged really, truly to ijtihad. They are always, these traditional ulama are always actually making the decisions to be taken in the present connected to the past. You are always looking for precedents. Even the mujtahid, you put so many obstacles to ijtihad that ijtihad becomes impossible. You say, yeah, ijtihad is great, the mujtahid should be praised, but then in order to be a mujtahid, you have to know 500 cases of changing a role, etc. You have to know X amount of precedents, and you do not realize that you are actually again just putting the present case of what you have to decide under the command of the past. You connect it to the past instead of connecting it to the possible and to the future. You are not thinking that the future is what should be dictating the actions you take today. You are thinking that the past is what has to dictate the actions that you have to conduct. And that is a way of never getting out of the petrification. So yes, it was inevitable in a way that these conservative people, both in the case of Bergson and in the case of Iqbal, would oppose their project and their philosophy.
Thank you. Any other questions? Diagne, Askari has asked about the individual and individuation.
Okay.
That this is a buzzword. It's a buzzword on campus. It's a buzzword in popular culture. Achieving your individuality, attaining your individuality, becoming individual. The questioner has asked that is Bergson's notion of individual and Iqbal's notion of individuation, is it the same as an autonomous individual who achieves his or her individuality cut off from and independent of relations to others?
Thank you so much. And this is a very important question, and there is a distinction to make here. This individuation has nothing to do with this individualism that we are so much praising as a buzzword. And you're absolutely right. This idea that I am an individual, I'm my own self, and that we see, by the way, in this understanding of freedom by people who think that going against vaccination is an affirmation of their individual freedom, etc. But I don't want to enter that controversy. Maybe there are people who are anti-vaccination, although I would be surprised if on campuses we find many of those. But no, in this case, it is really a philosophical notion of becoming an organized individual. And Iqbal compares that when he looks at this notion of individuation, what he has in mind is the trust that defines the human being as such. As the Quran says, that trust, this amana, has been proposed to many different beings, mountains even with their strengths, etc. Only the human being has accepted it. Only the human being has accepted this trust of becoming a person, the trust of personality, that and understanding that the stage of being a human is never is not a state precisely, it is a task. To be a human is to have the responsibility and the task of becoming human and achieving personality. And achieving personality is the same as achieving individuality. Individuality in this case is not just, looking at what belongs to me, what as an individual I should have this and that and that, and I affirm my individuality. And on the contrary, individuality is here. Individuation goes with the responsibility of fulfilling my duty as a human being, that is to say, fulfilling my duty as the khilafah that God has given me, and that nobody else could receive. That everything else, if a mountain had to receive it, as the Quran says, they would be just exploding and scattered. But the human being can have it. In the same way, the notion of individuality in Bergson has to do with going against dispersion. In fact, it is always saying that we are not parts, isolated parts coming together in a mechanical way, but organs coming together in a living way. This is the opposition between what it means to be organized as life and just put together as components, as mechanical components. That is how they understand it, the notion of individuality. So achieving individuality has nothing to do with the posture of individualism in this sense. It is, on the contrary, a way of trying as much as you can of imitating God. God is the only true individual. Only God can be an individual. And that is what Surah Al-Ikhlas says when it says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. I mean, samad itself would mean that absolute singularity, that absolute individuality. It is a very difficult word to translate, as you know all better than I do. And the reason for that is that it is an apex. The word samad appears only once in the Quran. Any other name of God or any other qualification for God appears many times. So you can make comparison, because that is how we understand a word, by seeing it employed in different contexts. And if you have a word that is employed just once, and in that particular case, how would you fully understand it? And Iqbal, in conversation with Bergson's notion of individual, understands like that the surah, the chapter Ikhlas precisely. this absolute affirmation of the individuality of God. When it says lam yalid wa lam yulad, if nothing comes out of it, it proceeds from nothing and nothing comes out of it. And that is what it defines an individual. Now, if something proceed from you, if you are able to reproduce, then you cannot be an individual. So this philosophical, metaphysical notion of individuality, achieving individuality and understanding achieving individuality as your responsibility vis-a-vis yourself, vis-a-vis achieving humanity in general, and vis-a-vis also taking care of the creation of God, because this is a very important aspect given the fact that we are living this environmental crisis, and understanding the khilafah of God as being custodian of God's creation. This is what it means to be an individual, and not just I do what I please and I cherish my so-called individual freedom because I'm an individual.
Thank you. I mean, if I heard you, if I heard correctly, that the popular notion of individuality equates individuality with autonomy, absolute autonomy. Iqbal's notion of individuality equates individuality with consciously taking the trust or carrying the trust which has been trusted to the human being by God. There's no notion, there's no possibility of an individual becoming an individual if they do not consciously undertake to fulfill the trust which has been entrusted to them by God. And for Bergson, there's no way the individual can attain their individuality unless they become organically a part of something that is bigger than them, an organ or an organism that is bigger than them. Was that an accurate summary of what you had said?
Indeed, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. There's another written question?
We have some more questions. I don't
Okay. Dr. Diagne, we do have a bunch of other questions, both written and in person, but we do not want to take more of your time because we know that you have a class and commitments. It is a Tuesday morning. So with your permission, whatever we do is with your permission next. With your permission, should we close the program?
Or one question.
Or have one more question?
Okay, let's have one more. Yes.
Yes. Okay. No. Very important question, a practical question. And it's not easy to navigate because we are individuals. We have to make this decision, right? For thinkers, students of thought from parts of the world that have a history of colonization, and I would correct a history of brutal colonization. When we look at Algeria, Vietnam, when we look at what the British did to the ulama in 1857. In this part of the world, we have a history of brutal colonization. What was done in West Africa, what was done in Congo. These are not facts that should be forgotten, and they cannot be forgotten. Now, for those of us who are coming from these parts of the world, and we're part of these communities, how does one achieve that balance between decolonizing philosophical thought and learning from the West? I think this is an excellent question. We want to both decolonize ourselves because that legacy is still at work. At the same time, we would want to be open to the West. How does one achieve that balance? And on this point, if you could answer this question, I would really appreciate it. Maybe in some personal terms, how have you struck this balance? What has helped you as an individual to strike this balance?
This is a very important question, and I'm glad we did not end before this question because obviously it is an important one. not really susceptible of just a simple, very straightforward answer, because we have, all of us, we have to ponder that question and meditate it, because obviously, yes, striking the right balance between taking into account the brutality of oppression and colonialism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the what we have, you and I, in this conversation described as thinking together, is something that we need to think about very, very carefully. I've written a book that to which I've given the title Bergson Postcolonial. And this is a provocative title, obviously, because Bergson never said a word about colonialism. It was not really under his radar to talk about colonialism, not one single word. Nevertheless, here is an author who has been so important in the colonial world. And why is that? Why is that? Why was his thinking uh, 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 so important for post-colonial thinkers, not just Iqbal, but also on the other side in West Africa, as I mentioned earlier, Senghor. And the reason why I'm mentioning this book of mine and that provocative title is that within the West, you have also post-colonial or anti-colonial thinking. And that is something we should not be ignoring. In other words, we, as Edward Said famously said, we should not wear metaphysical lenses when we are looking at the world. If we have a massive notion of what the colonial world is and a massive notion of what the West is, we are trapped in this metaphysical thinking. In a way, there is not such a thing as the West also. The West, what are we putting under the name the West? Of course, we have to look at these elements. What at one point it meant for the West to just expand outside of itself and have this brutal colonialism, forced labor in West Africa, colonialism, and so on and so forth. Yes, this has to be acknowledged and taken into account. Taken into account also every thinking and every thought that within the West itself goes against that face of the West. And Bergson is a good example of that, precisely because he is someone who never said anything for or against colonialism. Colonialism was not just in his own horizon, but he produced a thought that was so important for colonial thinkers or thinkers from the colonial world who were themselves engaged in the work of fighting against colonialism and the domination of the West. So this is how I would give a very first preliminary tentative response to that question. And I have the sense that it is preliminary and tentative because beyond this particular case, obviously, you can have also more complicated notions of what this means. But basic bottom line in what I'm saying is that we should dissolve these metaphysical, huge, unquestioned identities and entities that we call the West and complicate it. For example, when people say that we have to oppose our own epistemologies to the epistemology of the West, as a historian of science, I know that there is not such a thing as the epistemology of the West. This is simplification. When we say our epistemology against the epistemology of the West, what are we talking about? Epistemology of the West was at one point Aristotelian and Ptolemaic, and that it went against Aristotelian and Ptolemaic notion of cosmology, and so on and so forth. So you have many epistemologies. Science is a history in the first place. It is always unfolding. So when we think in terms that are not petrified, but in terms of movement and historicity and so on and so forth, when we think along the lines of Iqbal, who says, do not vilify time because time is God. If we understand fully that hadith that he quotes again and again, we may find a way of creating convergences and openness and movement towards what Bergson called open society precisely, which is achieving our humanity together in spite, not in ignorance of, but in spite of everything that has historically happened in terms of oppression and domination and so on, so forth. And that is in that sense very important as an answer to the challenges of our times, because that is a hadith of continuous opening of the tribe towards the achieving humanity, a responsible humanity, understanding its own khilafah as the mission and the task to not only achieve humanity, but protect the creation, God's creation, and being custodian of our earth instead of destroying it, instead of turning nature into natural resources, as we have done, unfortunately, for so long. So this is one tentative answer I had to that question. And again, it is not a question which is susceptible of a very simple answer at all. And I would like to end with words of gratitude the way I started. I really enjoyed, and I'm very honored for this encounter and for this virtual visit that I have been able to accomplish now to Pakistan. I thank everybody who invited me, and inshallah, hopefully, I will have a chance in the near future to set foot at last in Pakistan and have a chance to pay respect to um, the shrine of Allah, Iqbal.
Yes, well, inshallah, Aziz, it takes place soon. It will be our honor to host you. And then we look forward to that possibility. We know that you're very, very busy. You took this time out, and we will hold you. We will hold you to that, inshallah. You said earlier, because we're not maybe we're less than halfway into our discussion, and we have to cut it off. So, inshallah, we will at least virtually, if we can do it personally. So we look forward to that. And if I can just sum up, if I can try to sum up what you said in the last point, let us not look at the West or Western epistemology or the Western tradition in the way that some in the West want to look at the East, look at Islam, look at Africa, look at blacks, because they have painted them with one brush. And they do not see any diversity, they do not see any difference. And they have essentialized what it means to be Muslim. They have essentialized what it means to be religious. To be religious means to be backward. To be religious means to be wanting to go back to the 7th century. To be Muslim means to be hating the West. So Islam, the Muslim, has been essentialized like this by some people in the West. Those of us who are those of us who are trying to walk that, make that balance between the colonial heritage and opening ourselves up to quote unquote the West, the first step we must take is not to paint the West in those broad terms. As you said, there's a Bergson, the protest against the excesses of the Enlightenment reason emerged from the West itself first, before they emerged from anywhere in the East or the Muslim world. The protests against a closed universe emerged from Western science itself before they emerged from anything outside of Western science. And as those individuals trying to walk that balance or find that balance, that is a necessary but insufficient first step. I read you correctly on that, Professor Diagne.
No, I thank you very, very much for that.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I guess, Florian, would you like to say, or I have to say thank you to everyone? Thank you, everyone. Good night for those of you who are in the night time, and a good breakfast to you, those who have not yet had their breakfast. And we are very much on behalf of the French Embassy and Dylan Gillard, the cultural attaché there, on behalf of the Office of International Affairs. We are immensely grateful that you have taken 2 hours of your time, 2 hours of your very difficult and precious time on a Tuesday, day or night. It doesn't matter how difficult it was. We're most thankful and grateful. And we close off by saying, Fi Manillah, Godspeed.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.